Hello class. In this video, I'm gonna continue to show you more example of how to return multiple value from a function. So let's take a look at this example. So basically, when you declare a function, you have a return type, and that allows you to return only one value from your function. So in some application, you want to be able to return multiple values from your function. So how do we do that? Well, we do that by using pass by reference. So let's take a look at this compute sum and average. This is the variation of the previous example that we look at where your function only return the average. But now we say we want to return both the sum and the average. Then how do we do that? Well, it's very straightforward in C++. These are our function header. The function name is compute sum and average. And notice that I changed the return. Previously, it returned the average, which is double. Now we change it to void. So it's not gonna it doesn't need a return statement, but it returned a couple of values by using the pass by reference parameter. So compute sum and average take three parameters. Num count, which is the number of integer count, and you notice that there is no ampersand in front of num count. It means that this parameter is still passed by value. That means we will not be able to change num count in this function, but we don't need to. We don't need to change num count. What we need is to return sum and average. So the next two parameter in this list is double sum, and notice that there is an ampersand in front of sum. It indicates that this parameter is passed by reference. And the same thing for average. Ampersand in front, that means passed by reference. It means this function should be able to change the original value of the variable sum and average. And the way we calculate the sum is exactly the same as before. The difference now is we initialize this sum to 0 before the for loop. And we ask the user to enter the integer input, the number, and then we just accumulate into the sum. So we take sum equal to sum plus current value. And after we finish this loop, we get out of the loop and then we say the average is the sum divided by num count. So the average is the parameter that is passed by reference into this function. And take a look at how the main program or the main function call that function. So it is similar to the example we saw before. We ask the user enter the number of values, we read into num values, and we call the function compute sum and average. And we pass the argument num values, that is this variable, into the function. That is num count in the parameter list. The next two arguments we pass in here is sum val and average val. Sum val is our local variable in main right here. We declare sum val, we did not assign any value, we didn't initialize anything. Average val has no value, we didn't assign anything, did not initialize anything. So after we make the function call, this function compute average will update or change the original contents of these two variables, or it will pass back the result to the main function. And after we return from compute sum and average, we print the sum. And notice that I'm using set precision. Hopefully you still remember how to do that in the previous chapter. And also set precision, use the library in here. So you need to include IO manipulate IP. And we also print the average and we set the precision to 3 decimal places. So let's run this function and then you see how that works. So let's say the number of value, I'm going to enter 4. And again, I just type some random number. Oops, sorry, that's not a valid input. Okay. Type some random number here. And you see sum has the precision of 2 digits. Average has the precision of 3 digits. And you see that in this case, we get back to return value from parameter list by using pass by reference into the function. And that's it for this example. So let's go back to the slides. We got a few more things to cover in the slide. Okay, so global versus local variables. Global variable is any variable you declare outside of any function. So right here, I have an integer variable, my global, and I initialize to 5. So this variable is defined outside of my main and outside of any function. Another global variable I have is a constant inch per foot. And notice that I have the keyword const in front. That means these variables is initialized to 12 and you cannot change this value after it is initialized. And that's what constant means. And we use that so that we don't allow any code anywhere, or we don't want to make mistake to change this. So that's why we want it to be constant. A variable that is declared within any curly brace, like in here, where I have in main, I have the open curly brace and close curly brace, and my local variable I initialize too. So this is called local variable because it is declared inside a curly brace. Versus here, global is declared outside of any curly brace. And notice that global variable should be used only when there is no other solution. It's not good programming practice to use global variable. It's okay to use constant as the global variable, but it's not recommended. It is valid syntax, it is okay, but it's not recommended to use global variable like this unless you have no choice, you couldn't figure out how to pass the variable between function, or it's very difficult to pass those values. All right, we get into a situation where we may make a mistake or we do it by intention. The global variable name is 2 names. It's global variable, and also I have a local variables with the same name. So inside my main function, I say see out 2 names. This is where the confusion come in. And then you look at the code and you said, what? There are 2 variables with the same name, the global variables and also the local variable. So when we do cout, which one do we print? Well, the answer is the local variable. It's gonna print value 2. And then the next question will be, well, if if I have 2 variables of the same name, one local variable, one global variable, then if I do cout, it always print the local variable. So what if I really want to print this global variable? What do I do? Well, the answer is very simple. you put colon in front of that variable. For example, this is just a continuation with different variable name. I have new val, global variable 10, and then 0, and then I have a local variable 10, same value, right? Then I print value of global variable. I need to specify colon in front of that variable name. That's global. And I can print the local variable without colon in front. So that's how you handle two variable with the same name. However, try to avoid this situation because it can be very tricky and very hard to debug when you have two variables up that have the same name. That's not recommended. It's very hard to debug. I just want to point out how you use it, but it's not recommended to use it. Um, the next example I want to show you is the default argument. So let's say we define a function sum. This function can take either 2 parameters or 3 or 4. So if we get 2, then the last 2 arguments or parameters will be assigned the default value. So we just say return all of these. And let's take a look at how this function is called. You can call this function with 2 variables, 2 arguments, right? I can say, hey, take the sum of 10 and 15. Or I can say, can you calculate the sum of 10, 15, 25? So in the first case, when you call sum with 2 variables, 2 arguments right here, what happened is the function already declared these 2 default arguments. If the caller doesn't pass in the last 2, they will be initialized to 0. So in this case, X is 10, Y is 15, and then Z and W both are 0. So this return statement works fine because it only use like only X and Y has a value. Y and Z do not have a value, so that the default value will be used. The second call, sum, and we pass in 3 variables and 3 values, 10, 15, and 25. And that will take the X is 10, Y is 15, and Z got the value of 25 because the user or the caller called this function with Z with the value of 25. So 0 will not be used, but W will be 0 because the caller only called with 3 arguments. The next call, the sum, the caller calls sum with all 4 values. In this case, both Z and W have value. So 25 and 30 will be used, not 0. So that's how default parameter arguments work. So these couple of slides just explain how the default variable works. Let's switch to code to see how that really works. And I already copied the code into here. Let's compile and run. You see, on the first call, sum is 25. That's the sum of 10 and 15. The second call, 10, 15, 25, that's 50. The third call, sum 15, 10, 15, 25, and 30. Now, let's say we don't specify the default value and see if these will work. So let me comment out this line and just declare a functions like a regular function we have, what we have seen so far without default value. So I just have X, Y, Z, and W. And I don't specify any default value. Then I save, and then I do build and compile. So now you see that the compiler complaint, the compiler will say too few arguments to functions because the function expect 4 parameters, X, Y, Z, W, and we call it with only 2. So that's the problem. If we don't specify the default value, the only code, let's say I comment out this line of code and see if the next line will work. Save, run. The same problem on line 17. The compiler complained that there are too few arguments to function. All right, let's comment out this line. Say that's the only line that works when you call with all 4 arguments from here. Now there is no error message. It works fine. And also the default parameters here, the default value have to be the end. You cannot specify the default parameter at the beginning. So X can never have a default value. So if you do that, you say default parameter missing 3, 4, and so on. You cannot have a default at the beginning. You have to have a default at the end. You can have 1 default or 2 default, but it have to be at the end, cannot beginning. So let's try with only 1 default value, W. Instead of default value of 0, I can specify a default value of anything I want, W. So if I change W to 100, this line will also work because I'm calling sum with 3 arguments right here. This is 1, X, number 2 is Y, number 3 is Z. I am not passing W, so it will get a value of 100. Let's save it, compile and run and see this also work. You see the third one, you see this line is 150 because I say W is in this, the default value for W is 100. All right, so that's the end of this run. Let's go back and see. We have one more example. Function overloading. Let me switch to code so it's easy to see the output and the run. All right, so function overloading means you can have the same function name that take different parameter type. So they are all 3 functions have the same name, print, but they take different parameter type. The first function take an integers. And we just do cout to see which one is being called. Second function do print double. Third function say print char. In the main functions, we are calling print 3 different times with 3 different values. So when I say print and I pass in an integer, 10 is an integer, this function will be called because the argument I'm passing right here matches the type of the parameter that this function takes. So it's going to call this one. The second one print will call this because 10.5 is not an integer, but it is a double. It matches with this function, double. The third call, I say print character A. That doesn't match with this, doesn't match with this, but match with char. So let's run this code, and then you see the output. You see, it's the first line, the first print 10, let's say here is integer 10. That's from here is in int. The second call here is in double, big double. The third call, capital A, is in char. So you can define the same function, the multiple function with the same name that take different parameters. And when you call it, it will know, the compiler know which one you're calling based on the parameter type. So that's the function overloading example. And that's all example of functions. I just want to mention common mistake that you may make when you write function. If you pass more or less argument to a function, that is an error. That's a syntax error. Compiler check that, and you saw in the last example, I pass in more or less, the compiler complains. That's the problem. Or passing incompatible data type to a function. Let's say the function take an int and you pass in a float, that may not work. Or function take an int and you pass in a string, that won't work either. A void function does not return a value. It should not return a value. So when you declare a function as void, like what you saw, it should not return a value. On the other hand, if a function is expected to return a value and you don't have a return statement, that's also a mistake. And in the Zai book, I think they listed more, and with more explanation. You should look at Zai book to see more mistake when you're using function. All right, so that's the end of this video. Thanks for watching.